up the pace a little bit because we want to get to solutions, ideas of tools that might be important to actually implement missing middle housing.
I just wanted to show you here a couple more examples, so just to take a look. We've already gone through, I think, who this benefits. Continue on. The zones that we are looking at today are the zones that we have. As you know, mostly the R zones are predominant throughout the county, but there also is the townhouse zones and CRN, which CRN is probably the most accepting of missing middle types, although there still is a process that you'd have to go through to try to implement it. And it's also one of our smallest zones as far as area in the county.
Okay, now in the ADU legislation or zoning change, we do not allow them in townhomes, is my understanding. So is that a missed opportunity for missing middle type housing? I was sort of advised that at least with existing townhomes, it was.
Yeah, I think
not going to be likely or something. But
I think you're right.
No.
However, I think there are opportunities. I'm more in is when I look at this and when I look at the different jurisdictions across the country, the ones that are the most successful are the ones that offer the most options. Right. The most flexible, and so I wouldn't say no to adding a townhouse or adding a unit to a townhouse. We were just in a place you might want to take a look at it if you get a chance. We were just in Louisville, Kentucky last week for the Congress for New Urbanism and went to a brand new community called Norton Commons. And there, right in their downtown core, were townhouses with basements, but there was an 8-foot deep light well in the front. So you went down.
Well, that's the standard typology of a city row house.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
English
you can see it
basements.
all over Washington.
Exactly. And so those had units below and then, townhouses above, right in the core of the downtown.
Interesting. Well, we might want to take a closer look at that issue as we're still working on the ADU.
Sure. So
see
as
what
part
the
of
folks
the
outside think about that. But
as part of the report, we also, Torty Gallison Partners, created some types and different sort of restriction or at least the components, the parking, the lot dimensions, and so on for different types. And so if you look through the book, you'll be able to see them there. The unit at the bottom right, though, I think is unique. That was built in Washington, D.C. There's 6 units in that building, even though it looks like a fairly contemporary townhouse in a normal townhouse and small house community neighborhood within D.C. There are 6 units in that. So this is what we talk about how it fits within existing neighborhoods and the character and the quality. Next. Some more. The one on the upper right is a 12-plex apartment building that looks like a very large mansion. That's in King Farm. King Farm and Kentlands were 2 communities that the developers early on in their development decided they wanted to create missing middle types within the community, and so it was, they went through the process of having those allowed and developed in their communities, and I think it's helped both of those communities tremendously.
could you do a 4-plex now in Clarksburg if you're the developer there? Can you do a 4-plex as part of your?
No.
No, I don't believe so.
Really? So you can put up tens of thousands of units, and you can put up apartment buildings, but you can't put up a 4-plex.
Well, it depends on the zone, and most of the zones in Clarksburg, like Cabin Branch and the town center, would probably not allow you to just take a vacant lot and put up a fourplex. But we're going to talk about the zones, and maybe we can just get to those, because, again, I'm very interested in the tools that will actually make this possible.
We
Just quickly,
Yep.
so you mentioned 2 examples, and we have talked about them fairly frequently of late. I think it's important. I mean, these are 2 of the most successful new developments, large-scale new developments that have occurred, and they incorporate a lot of the things that we are talking about here as policy and figuring out what the best and appropriate way to expand and extend upon those. And this was a market-based solution. This wasn't the government going to the community and saying this is what you ought to do. This was the business community based on the market demand saying, here's what we'd like to do. We can't do it currently. But my understanding is I only know of projects that the cities have approved as, municipalities that have zoning authority. Has the county ever approved similar opportunities like this where a
Yeah,
infill developer had a large-scale project and they allowed for, a different type of use than was generally allowable in that particular zone?
in Clarksburg Town Center, we did allow on certain lots for what we called mansion units. It was supposed to be very similar to King Farm. They were supposed to be 8 to 10 unit. I think they were apartment buildings, not condos. And some of them were built, but they did not, very frankly, they did not turn out very well. And it wasn't that the idea of the density did not turn out very well. It was, I think, the execution did not turn out very well. And that is part of the reason, I think, both in King Farm and in Kentlands, there are very clear design guidelines. And so when these projects are built, they know that the different unit types are going to be built to a standard. So we did experiment back in the late 90s, early 200s with Clarksburg Town Center and some of the mansion houses, but they were not executed very well.
I'd love to talk more about that because I am particularly interested in this. I think that is a legitimate concern, and I know we always get into this, what we can and what we can't do here, and that we can't legislate taste. Unfortunately, I'm not sure most people would want me to legislate my own, but that is a challenge that we face in this, and figuring out how we thread that needle of having some of these really successful, high quality, aesthetically pleasing missing middle options while serving our purpose. I'd love to figure out how we can make that
We have an
part
idea.
of it. So I look forward to that.
We have an idea.
Yeah, I want to, I'm going to skip through some slides here on, and just reiterate that we did look at a lot of different jurisdictions and what they're doing. A lot of the missing middle initiatives throughout the country are based on form-based codes. There are a lot more flexibility that's provided, and so those are some of the kind of the characteristics that we saw throughout the country. We also did an economic study, and I'll just go, we had a series of developers come in that helped us, focus groups to determine what were sort of the restrictions and barriers that we have today. We also did a study of a site within the county, that kind of different development scenarios, a high density scenario versus a mix of high density and missing middle, and then a solid missing middle. To determine kind of what the pro forma of those different developments would be, to start to see, again, some real numbers. And we used all of that for our study in this report, and you'll see it in the booklet that you've received. There are barriers, and we also, one of the biggest things I think on the economic study was there was a very strong identification of large developers versus smaller developers. And a lot of the missing middle that's created in this country is created by mom and pop, family type developments. And so clearly there needs to be more study done on providing incentives for those people, because what happens is if they're taking an equity loan out of their house to help maybe build a duplex or to build an accessory dwelling unit, that's a big burden. And so if there's a way that can be transferred into sort of a commercial loan, once they start renting it and making money on the unit, that's something that begins to free up more money. And so currently the three types that I told you about, single family, townhouse, and luxury apartment, all of those are proven. They have a track record. So banks loan for those types. They do not loan typically for the missing middle because it does not have a track record over the last 60 years. Next. So some of the things that we are looking at, I believe there's 6 items that we started to discuss within these groups and within staff. And by the way, that upper right corner is the unit that I was telling you about, the McMansion in Colorado. That's actually a 4-plex. It looks like a very large house, but that is 4 units in that house right there. And the houses you can see around it are similar in size and character. But one of the things that we're looking at is to create through a zoning text amendment and through the optional method get a zoning text amendment within the missing middle optional method of development and essentially figure out the areas that would be most prevalent for missing middle along transit or near transit, near on the edges of neighborhoods are key areas that we've identified. And then create some criteria, essentially some guidelines that can be used to make sure that those units going in within this process could be reviewed and then would be allowed in neighborhoods throughout the county.
And this connects a little bit with some of the discussions we're beginning to have about our general plan and about the idea of looking at corridors, particularly looking at what kind of development is appropriate along corridors. One of the things I want to be very clear about is that we are not talking about going in and plopping a sixplex or an eightplex in the middle of a stable single-family neighborhood. But what we are talking about is taking a look at perhaps some of those edges, particularly along corridors that have either very active existing bus lines or bus rapid transit that is planned for those corridors, and saying, how can we create some additional housing along those corridors that actually both has the benefit of doing all the wonderful missing middle types of benefits that Paul has described, but also benefit the single-family neighborhoods because they provide a transition for those single-family neighborhoods between very busy, very active transit corridors and the quieter, calmer sort of single-family neighborhoods. And so we think that that is a very rich opportunity. We're going to be talking about some of that during the general plan. But I think the idea here is if you created a missing middle optional method option, again, under optional method, there can be a lot of criteria. There can be distance from a transit line requirements. There can be design criteria. There can be a lot of additional ways to guide and direct that development. And so we think that that has a lot of potential.
Okay, do you want to talk about this one, or do you want to hear them all?
Well,
I want to talk
let
about
us
this
hear-
one, but you've got some others, and then we can come back.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'll go real quick here. Another option that we were talking about is evaluate the ability to use a floating zone and create a missing middle housing floating zone. It would take a little bit more time. Encourage rezoning to
And
CRN.
that's not exclusive of an optional method, right?
Correct. We could encourage rezoning to provide more CRN zones, which again are more receptive to missing middle types in some of our master plans throughout the county. Consider a missing middle functional master plan as another opportunity potentially.
What does that do? What is a functional master plan?
Well, the trick is that anything that we do in terms of zoning, if we created a new missing middle zone, the only way to apply that zone would be to do a functional plan and then a sectional map amendment. We actually think that option is not a great option because it would be very time-consuming to do. And I think a lot of the same exploration will happen during our general plan, but to do a countywide functional plan and then a sectional map amendment would be several years in the making. We think it's actually probably better to take a look at a ZTA that would allow you to, in existing zones, pick a missing middle optional method and follow certain guidelines.
I want just the image up in the upper right. This is in Sacramento. This is a townhouse court that was created on 2 lots in a single-family zone. In this case, built in the 1930s, but the 80 units an acre in that building, even though it's a 2-story building and is the similar character and quality of the neighbors around them. Yeah, go ahead. And the last couple of things that we were looking at is the potential of creating kind of a pilot project within the county, potentially taking a piece of county-owned land and having a competition or a request for proposals from a developer architecture teams to come up with ideas on missing middle types to fill that lot and use that to show that, one, missing middle housing can be created and that it's actually a great opportunity, a great option, and two, to analyze it even further and see, how it fits and how it works within existing communities. Finally, I think we were talking about putting together a staff and consultant team to look at potential financial incentives that can be provided for missing middle. And I think that's something either through the financing or through some of the hookup fees and the taxing opportunities as well.
And I think the reason that that's something we need to do that's important is, again, for the small builders, they like certainty. They like what they've done for the last 20 years. They'd like to do it for the next 20 years. So, for example, there was a recent subdivision in Tacoma Park along Philadelphia Avenue, and it was essentially 2 houses on 2 lots, and they were able to subdivide and get 3 houses and created 3 lots. Paul did a very interesting study where, again, this is on a busy road that has a lot of buses. If they had done a courtyard housing on this same piece of land, they probably could have gotten 14 units. But they would have had to do it through 14 cottages, essentially. But they would have had to do it through an optional method, and that means there isn't certainty. So they get more benefit, but there's less certainty. So a lot of the small builders will say, oh, forget it. I'm just going to do my 3 lots and get my 3 houses, and that's very certain, and it's not controversial. I'm just going to do that.
The optional method has to be granted by the planning board?
The optional method would be a site plan that would be approved by the planning board, yes.
That's
But that's why additional incentives, for example, again, they aren't even tax incentives, it would be things like hookup fees. One of the things that's very expensive whenever you're building any new houses is your additional hookup fees. If you could reduce the cost of hookup fees, that would be an incentive to do some of these kinds of projects. That's just one example of something that might be considered.
Okay. All right, why don't we go in reverse order here? I like the idea of a staff consulting group on financing. Is that something you're suggesting the planning department would be able to convene? It might be appropriate?
That would be the initial suggestion, yes.
I think I'm going to comment on each of these, and then we can come back and have discussion from council members on the whole package. I think that's terrific. I'd love to hear more about how you would operationalize that, and we can talk about that. To number 5, on the idea of a pilot, that sounds intriguing. I worry a little bit that some would say, well, you should wait until the pilot is done before you do anything, and then that could be 6-7 years before
Right.
you actually have occupancy.
There was some discussion and some wording in the new Veers Mill master plan about the idea of missing middle, and one of the sites that we looked at and studied was in that corridor.
Right. Well, if they were to move forward on that, that's privately owned. That's
Yeah.
not a public property. But if they were to move forward on that, sure, we could partner with them and
Yeah.
help them pilot something if they are moving forward. But, I like the idea of competitions. I just wouldn't want them to be positioned as piloting this in order to demonstrate its effectiveness, because then I think we're to be in keeping with that. We would wait until we see the effectiveness,
Right.
which
You're right.
But to the previous slide. So the floating zone is intriguing. Can you go to the first one? So the first slide, please. So this is a great idea. I'm very interested in this. I'd like to see if my colleagues might want to explore this as a committee, ZTA. But I've had this presentation now probably about a year ago, the first time I got the presentation, and wanted to move forward with it at that time, but decided that we would proceed with the ADU issue first, and so we put that into motion. But I think it's very intriguing. So are you suggesting that the planning board could, what would be your version of process here?
Well, if it is something that the Fed committee is interested in, we would work with council staff, with Pam Dunn and Jeff Zients, and talk to them about, but what a potential ZTA might be that would capture this. We can certainly work with them on that.
Okay, good point for discussion. Let's go to my colleagues. Mr. Jawanda.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the presentation. Couple things. You mentioned 18% of available land in the county, and I've heard Mr. Anderson, I think, mention a similar number before. Obviously, not all that's going to be type of land that would be right for this. Have you done any analysis of that 18%, which you think would be under the criteria and what the study you've done would be available?
No, not yet. And in fact, to be perfectly honest, some of this missing middle might even go within areas that are outside of that 18%. When we looked at that 18%,
Already developed.
we took,
Right.
yes, the criteria was that it was already developed, meaning it was constrained. But this might be a possibility even for some of those areas.
And we also assumed that any land that's currently zoned single-family is not available. So, for example, on those corridors like Colesville Road, where you already have homes that have been turned into dentist offices
Yeah.
because nobody wants to live right where your front yard is basically 6 or 8 lanes of traffic, those lots would not be considered in that analysis. But it wouldn't be a major undertaking, I think, to try to
Figure out. That's something I'd love to see. I mean, you talked about the edges. Obviously, Colesville Road is one. And then, in those, just staying on that point for a second since you brought it up, because of the undesirability of those tend to be families that are either multi-generational or can afford, it's a little more affordable, people who are willing to live there, and mostly communities of color, in my experience, of knocking, because I tend to knock those doors the first so I can get my signs up, so I've knocked a lot of edges on a lot of major roads in Montgomery County, for that purpose, and had a lot of conversations. So the other question, so if we could get a list I want to be more formal. I know we've kind of been floating. Speaking of floating zones, we've been floating on the council as far as what the follow-up is, but I would love to see specifically if you guys could do that analysis. The other thing you mentioned, so the duplex I lived in Brooklyn, for example, which did have parking, which is another interesting concept I want to ask about this. When the grid city was when the grid models were created in a lot of cities, you had the alleys that allowed for parking, so, in addition to the street parking. So that's something that probably hard to recreate that in this current environment, but I don't know, you could comment on that. But that, that's $500,000 now. I still own it and I rent it out, and for that 1,000 square feet near a metro, near Fort Totten Metro. So I wonder, how are you defining missing middle? Because that's not really, you could, for $500,000 in East County, you could get the 3,500 square feet.
Yeah, and I do want to be very, very clear because there has been misunderstanding on this. We're talking about building form and smaller unit size, and that can tend to mean that the cost of the unit is less expensive. But it is not absolutely in every case going to be middle or lower income housing. It may be upper income housing. So I want to make sure that, we're not trying to present something that folks will misunderstand. We are not necessarily talking about this as the end-all be-all solution to our affordable housing crisis in this county. We think it has the potential to be another tool in the toolkit. We think that particularly if you're in an area where you have some more affordable land, that you can increase the density through a building form that does not damage the nearby single-family neighborhoods. And when you can increase that building density, you can create smaller, less expensive units. But it is not a promise that they are going to be, middle or low income accessible. So I just want to be very clear about that, that is not, when we say missing middle, the middle is more the form.
The form and type.
The
Well,
form
I
and
wanted
type.
to give you the opportunity to say, I think that's critically important in this discussion because location, right? It's going to depend on where you build these and it is something we need to factor in thinking about it because the density issue and how affordable it's going to be, and those are all policy, what the character of the neighborhood, and I agree. And, in the eastern part of the county where I live, if you did this on some places, it would create affordability and would help people who are maybe living in multifamily households already, for example. The last thing I wanted to ask is about the incentives. You mentioned the mom and pops, which was an interesting idea, and the smaller folks who might own the land that aren't the big developers, but that might be interested in doing this. That piqued my interest in making it easier for them to get financing. Where have you seen, what have you seen, and could you talk about that a
Yeah,
little more?
sure. Some of the other opportunities, for instance, in Oregon, if you do a courtyard housing, so a cluster of essentially cottages or bungalows around a central courtyard, in Oregon, they charge you one hookup fee for that cluster, rather than, if there's 8 units, 8 hookups. That's just for, water and sewer, for instance. So other types of incentives like that become, more prevalent. And then also just taxing, the taxes for a new unit. If it could be combined together, and so that there's essentially taxes for the development rather than each individual unit to reduce the individual costs.
Those aren't based on the size of the developer, though, because I see what I'm
Right.
trying to get at is how do you incentivize the smaller, that may be,
Well-
Well, I think that one of the key issues is certainty for small-time players. Because if you're JBG, you're not going to do that. You're not interested in this market because it's just not enough there for it to make any sense. If you're a tear-down builder, you're the kind of, builder who's just going door to door and saying, in the Saks neighborhood in Bethesda, I could offer somebody $900,000 million for their house. It's perfectly good condition, but if I tear that house down, build a $1.8 million, $2 million house on the same lot, build it out to the limits of the zoning and the development standards, I know for sure. Not only do I know, but if you're the owner of that house, I make you an offer. I say, I am willing to offer you this purchase price for this house because and you can be on your way tomorrow. You can buy something. You can take your money, go to some other place, maybe even get a windfall that you have some money left over, can downsize, whatever it is you want to do. And both sides of that transaction know on day one that they can close that deal, and the builder can get on with building it, the seller can get on with vacating the premises, going and find someplace else to live. If you have to go through a lengthy process where you don't know, you're going to have to go through hearing examiner, you might have to come to the council for a rezoning application. It could be up in the air for years. And that not only deters the small business person who's in the business of doing this type of project, it deters the sellers too, because if you're the homeowner and somebody comes to your door and says, hey, I could offer you, here's the good news, I could offer you more money than you thought your house is worth. Bad news is you're gonna have to sit around and wait for 2 or 3 years. At the end of that process, we might not be able to close this deal because I gotta have a contingency that I have to be able to get this rezoning application approved. So if you're gonna get those small-time players involved, you're gonna have to create some certainty in this process that it can't be, hey, we'll figure this out in 2 or 3 years down the road. if you're JBG or even your EYA, you're in the business of doing some of these, townhouse type of product. You might be willing to do 50 townhouses, but you're not going to build a sixplex. Those projects are too small even for these relatively specialized infill niche real estate companies. So I think that that's the jugular vein here. And the reason that the rezoning, the floating zone idea, I think is, I would encourage you, if you want to see this happen, you got to go a little bit further than the rezoning, the floating zone proposal. You need to do something that's more like optional method, where you have to have some development standards. You maybe even have design guidelines that have some more form-based elements than would be true of a single-family house. But you've narrowed the range of uncertainty. You say, okay, I still got to go through some discretionary review process at the planning board, perhaps, but I don't have to wonder, can I get this yield of 6 units on the lot, or 3 units, or whatever the number is.
There's some light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah.
And the other thing that you have as a tool is you were just talking with folks from DHCA. DHCA has the ability to do bridge loans to help people make projects happen. So for example, the Octave, which was a office building conversion to small condos, which at least when they initially sold were very affordable small condos, was only happened because of I think it was a $2 million or $2.5 million bridge loan that DHCA provided, which was paid back because the project, very quickly, because the project was so successful. But we have within our own county government the ability to create financing methods that help smaller developers doing innovative housing projects.
Thank you. And I'd love to talk about that more. And I appreciate, Gwen, that you framed the conversation, because I think this is going to be very important about this missing middle. The example you provided of wanting to downsize, the basis of that argument is that you needed to be able to afford to move somewhere to downsize. So we have to honestly have the conversation about what this is going to mean in different places, and that has to be a transparent conversation when we're doing the analysis of where the land is. I don't think we don't want to hide the 8 ball on that and be open about that conversation. It's going to mean different things to different people, and there's going to be an analysis that needs to happen, and as we're making the policy determination. So I appreciate you framing it that way. Thank you.
Thanks. I think that, again, this is a way to create housing that's more affordable, because you reduce your land costs, because you got 2 units sharing the land cost or 3 units sharing the land cost, and then they're often smaller, and most housing is fairly aligned with per square foot costs, so fewer square feet, it's going to be more affordable. It's and then from there, it will depend a lot on the location. It might be a more affordable way to live in Bethesda than you would otherwise have available. Doesn't mean it's going to be cheap. Or it could be a more affordable way to live in Silver Spring or Tacoma Park. Any of the above. So that is, it's going to be more affordable than a single unit property. Like that, I think we can say with certainty. And that is where we're struggling, is that, we've got apartment buildings, and we got single unit buildings, and we don't have much in between, and that's the missing middle. Okay, so, Andrew.
Thank you. I think I'm glad we've discussed it the way that we have, because I think it's important. There's this idea that that we should be in pursuit of the perfect, and in housing that just doesn't exist. Housing is a game of relativity, and everything is based on the cost of the land, and that's based on the location. And the question is, what are the access points to that location, and who can afford it? And so by providing a greater diversity of housing, we provide greater access points for more people. And then from there, we then can have the conversation of what can we do to manipulate the market on the margins in modest ways. MPDU program, modest but important program the bridge loan program, modest but an important one. But the key to all of this is we can't create markets that don't exist. And so I think it's important that we talk about this in the basis of reality and not in the idea of rhetorical perfection, because it's just not realistic and it's not serious and it's not moving towards any type of real significant policy goal except to say why we don't want things or why we're opposed to things. And so I just think it's important to do that. I think the conversation before and what Councilmember Giordano said, I think is critical here as we talk about this. One of the main issues, we separate out the millennial housing issue and the aging adult population issue. They are literally the same problem. They are two symptoms of the same disease that we are struggling to be able to treat, much less cure. And the idea is, to the point that Councilmember Giordano made, you can't downsize an aging community in Montgomery County today. You literally cannot leave your home and find a home that downsizes that saves you enough money to make it worthwhile, much less worth the disruption of moving after you've lived in the same home for 20, 30, 40 years. And so not only is that really harming the aging adult population, it is preventing the freeing up of housing for the young adult worker population. And so this is, we talk about these as two ends of a spectrum. They're not. They are, different points on the same circle, and that circle has created a problem for everybody. So I appreciate the fact that we're having this conversation. I think it's important for us to discuss. I think it's critical that we not get caught up in the relative game of exactly what point on the income spectrum is this going to resolve. It's a broader question of we do not have enough housing for people who need housing, and that has caused massive challenges for affordability at every edge and every part of the spectrum. And we need to create more housing, and we need to be creative about it. So specifically to these points that have been made, I am very interested in learning more and figuring out in reality how the first proposal would work with optional method development. I'm particularly interested. I know you've said about the design standards. I'm still confused as to how that would work, or at least not clear as to how that would work. I mean, we hear all the time from our zoning lawyers that you can't legislate taste, as I mentioned before, and so how we can maintain the character of neighborhoods, which I am appreciative of, speaking specifically about architectural design, not speaking to other elements that we've heard from recently, but I think that is a legitimate concern. And I'm also curious, we're about to undertake the general plan. What of this, particularly with zoning specifically, the chair mentioned ZTA and taking that on, but at what point is this a conversation that can be had in the context of a general plan and particularly focusing on, for instance, an emphasis on the corridors? I'd be particularly interested, and we talked during the Veers Mill corridor plan extensively, and I brought this up, and I think all of us brought this up, and Chair Rima brought it up on our tour itself, but the question of missing middle townhouse type, specifically along the corridors along Veers Mill as a transition into the neighborhoods, which made sense for a number of reasons, not least of which those are homes that are not selling and renting for as much because they're in less desirable areas along major corridors that have the noise and traffic and pollution and all the other challenges that go alongside that. Can you speak a little bit to that, of what opportunity we may have during the general plan to discuss this?
And we're about to get a little bit of a briefing about the general plan and the trends report, but I do think that one of the major themes in the general plan is going to be looking at the corridors in our wedges and corridors system that we have in this county. I think that we have not looked at the corridors in a very fine-grained kind of way, and I think that is going to be an important theme as we get into the general plan. And different corridors certainly have different character. there are different issues along each corridor. But I think that, again, we may find as we get into the general plan that, we may find appropriate places for this kind of development, again, along the corridors that helps provide the transition between the busier transportation areas and the single-family neighborhoods. I think that, again, it's not that we have to work in a linear way. I think that we could be talking about the ZTA, talking about a tool that goes into place while we're also diving into the general plan and thinking about corridors and thinking about what character different corridors may have, and it may all be able to come together.
But is there a process issue there? I mean, I think having the conversation here about this specifically, I am totally for, and I think that is very important because with this, I mean, we've talked very big picture here, but I'm interested in the details and in the implementation into how this actually works and how this actually looks and what the reality is actually going to be. If we're going to be taking it up as part of the general plan and focusing on corridors, doing a ZTA that focuses on optional method, I mean, two parallel tracks that aren't necessarily doing the same things, it would seem to me
Well,
that is not a helpful.
How do they
I do
relate
want to
process?
mention, the general plan is not going to result in a sectional map amendment, rezoning any portions of Montgomery County. The general plan is more of a high-level policy document that identifies policies and direction, but does not actually take up zoning.
Yeah, well, I'm familiar with that aspect. My question is, in a process where you're setting policy that is supposed to be the overarching vision of zoning, to move forward with, a very significant zoning change, and I think this is a very significant zoning change. Frankly, this could be a bigger zoning change than others that we've talked about recently, and I'm for that conversation. I think it's a critical conversation that we need to have, but I'm a little concerned about having that conversation, getting into the weeds before we've talked about what the forest should be. What is our policy goal, which is what the general plan is supposed to set for us, and then figuring out what are the details of the zoning specifically in order to get us there. I mean, could you speak to that?
That's a very good point, and, I think that the idea of drafting a ZTA is not something that's going to happen overnight. It's not, we would have to do a lot of additional research.
Don't challenge those of us up here.
We would have to, in fact, you're actually taking the words right out of my mouth. When I talked with Fed Chair Reamer about this a while ago, I said, let us continue to do the study, continue to talk to community members, work on drafting a piece of legislation that, again, is a tool that could have hopefully some broad support, but that also, again, I want to emphasize, we do tend to think in terms of all or nothing. And the reality is if you create a ZTA that allows optional method, you may be lucky to get one or two such applications in the whole county per year. And so this is not going to automatically transform any corridor or any neighborhood. It is going to add a optional method to allow people to consider some other housing types beyond the ones we've described.
Just my preference here would be that we continue and we have a robust, specific conversation on this first proposal, that it not necessarily be focused on drafting a ZTA, at least to start with, that it be used as part of the thought process, in the interest of having these conversations as we head into the general plan, making sure that, we are all on the same page of what, the interests and goals are, and then allowing the broad-based policy to dictate the specifics. That would be my personal preference. I obviously yield to colleagues on that, but I think that would be my preference for moving forward. Just switching gears quickly, and I'm sure there's some thoughts on that, but number 5, I believe it was, which is the county-owned property. Is that accurate? Yeah. So I think this is absolutely something that we could and should focus on, because it deals with specifically what our property is. I mean, what is the asset that we need? Land. What is an asset that we have? Land. How do we maximize and utilize that land to solve a critical need? Housing. I mean, I couldn't think of a better opportunity to do this. This has been something that I've been particularly interested in. Has the planning department talked with DGS at all about these opportunities? I know the Veers Mill plan, there was some, at least broad discussion about this, but could you talk specifically about the county's right of first refusal and whether or not you've had those conversations?
We have not spoken with DGS specifically about creating a pilot project like this. We have had conversations in the past about, and we have mapped all of the county-owned land in the county that's owned by any agency, whether it be fire and rescue or DGS or schools. And we have looked at all of the land that's available to think about different kinds of opportunities for affordable housing in general. I think that we certainly could go and talk with all of those parties about the idea of a pilot project for missing middle, but in direct answer to your question, we have not yet done that.
But this illustrates the difficulty with not proceeding, and I'm not talking about right this second, but I mean, if you wait either for a functional plan to follow or ZTA to follow the general plan, then you really don't even have an option to even look at most of the county properties. For example, the old library site. I think you're going to be considering the disposition of that tomorrow, if I'm not mistaken. That property is zoned, I think, R90. Mm-hmm. So one of the reasons why the previous county executive did not was sort of held up in considering a more ambitious affordable housing project on that site is because the zoning wouldn't support it. So at most, you might have a rezoning application for townhouses. Even that maybe is legally a little bit aggressive. So a lot of these public sites, school sites, former libraries, things like that, the underlying zoning is the lowest intensity residential zone. It's usually R90. In the case of Veers Mill, we teed it up to allow for the county to do, I don't know if you want to call it a pilot project, but certainly at least as a one-off, to do a missing middle type of project. And that was extensively discussed as part of the plan. But it's not as though even if the county executive or DGS decided tomorrow they wanted to do an experiment, they would have a lot of properties that are in public ownership that they could even pursue that. So that's one of the reasons we're sort of in a little bit of a jam, because you don't have the flexibility under the current zoning to do it.
Could the planning department put together a report on what the existing county-owned properties are, what their zoning is currently? I mean, I think that would be an interesting conversation to be had. I'm sensitive to that. I mean, because I think the real opportunity here is county-owned property. I mean, I just don't think that there's going to be enough of a market. I think we should be leading with this. I think we have an opportunity to lead because we own the land. We can do what the market can't do, including small owners of property, not even large developers who I don't think would be particularly interested in this because it doesn't have the returns that a larger development project would have, and it has a ton of challenges given all of the zoning questions and the hookup questions and all the tax questions and all the other things that we need to sort through. So I think the county should be leading here. I think if this is something that we're serious about, we shouldn't see if it works. We should test ourselves if it works and be extremely thoughtful about how we deploy it. But I think if there are challenges outside of Veers Mill based on what the existing zoning is, it'd be helpful to have an inventory of that, to know it, and then perhaps to have a follow-up conversation on it. I think the broad-based question here for me is, cart before the horse and whether or not we should be having these broad-based conversations about corridors. I think having a missing middle conversation as part of that is critical. I happen to think that the corridors are really where the true opportunity for missing middle housing exists, particularly as we think about BRT and others. I mean, we started this conversation with the idea that trains and trolleys were what built housing, for 100 years. And then we got away from that in the 1950s and 60s with the suburbanization of America, where everything was, you could get a bigger house with the white picket fence. The BRT is recreating the trolley model, and we have not thought through how to recreate the trolley model of zoning and housing as I believe we need to and we should in as thoughtful a way as we could. And that's what the general plan opportunity, I believe, presents, this idea of, how do we build a skeleton? How do we fill that skeleton in the most thoughtful way? And what are the policy goals that we have? And then once we have that conversation, then how do we lay in the zoning in order to achieve the policy that we've set out? So I hope we can have that conversation. I look forward to it.
Could you go back to the first slide? So a zoning text amendment could identify where, a locational criteria. I just want to make a comment. We're talking a lot about racial equity at the council and in the county. I think an application in this instance is you can't only allow this in lower income communities. There are stretches of every corridor, or most of them, that have quite a difference in terms of the cost of land and the cost of housing, and then often the racial composition of the residents. So I think that's how you think about that particular issue, is if you're only saying we ought to allow this where it's more affordable than currently, then that could be an issue. But if you're willing to say we're going to allow this in places where housing is more expensive and housing is less expensive, then I think you're proceeding in a manner that's good faith. I personally am very concerned about the quality of a lot of the housing at the edges of the corridors in the county. I think a lot of that housing was not built for the circumstances in which it sits now, which is right on heavily trafficked corridors where there's a lot of noise, there's a lot of pollution. And I see this as a way to bring a potential improvement of the quality of housing so that people are not kept up at night as much by cars and trucks slamming through the road, and they're not breathing as much pollution, at least inside their homes. And to me, that's significant. But then also, of course, the opportunity to create housing that's more affordable than what would otherwise be available in that location. And so I would not want to proceed in a sequential manner of, okay, let's talk about this as a policy matter in the general plan, and then let's proceed to begin to draft a ZTA. We won't make it in 4 years. I think there's more urgency here. So Gwen, can you explain a little bit about how the two could relate?
Right. Well, we can certainly, we've been given several assignments that I've heard, and we can come back to you with some additional data and information.
Okay.
And get back to you with that so that you can give us more direction. We can take a look again through our general plan work. We're already thinking about corridors amongst our staff work. We certainly want to hear from the community, and we're just starting our outreach activities later this week. But we are already thinking about corridors, and we can,
At one point, we were talking about that being a functional master plan.
Well, although I think, again, if we're working on the general plan and a functional master plan, I don't know that we have the capacity to do both, honestly. And so I think that we hoped to deal with a lot of the discussion about corridors within the context of the general plan. And then, again, through something like optional method, it can be applied anywhere in the zone where it's allowed. It doesn't require a rezoning, a local map amendment, a sectional map amendment. It can be applied anywhere within the zone where it's allowed. So, again, I think we have an opportunity to provide you with some more data and then maybe come back and see if you all, feel like you want us to keep working on this
Okay.
and come up with
Why don't
some
we do
actual
that?
legislation.
Maybe we'll plan a September Fed as a follow-up to this one. First thing in September. Take it from there. We
Sounds
can
great.
talk to council members in advance to help inform the discussion there.
And we'll look at the publicly owned land also.
Yeah, I mean,
per
I want to
Councilmember
say on that
Friedson's.
issue, that's an executive function. Putting land out for a contract is 100% an executive function. So we could say we think this is a good idea, but we can't do much more than that unless, planning, you couldn't even do it on your own property. You would have to go through a disposition process.
Right. No, we'd like to
Uh,
engage whenever the new director of DHCA is appointed. We'd like to engage that person.
Right. So I don't put a ton of stock in that option coming to fruition anytime soon, but I think it certainly is worth, initiating the conversation about. Anyway, I'm not putting a lot of eggs in that particular basket. Well,
I just as so how I feel is stated here, and I think we've gotten to a good place. I would agree, coming back with the requested data would be great, and then we can have a further conversation. Obviously, in a lot of the talk about missing middle, ADUs are a part of it. And so we're kind of already down the path here, so it makes sense to explore these other options, but do it in a deliberative way. And I think the context of the general plan is certainly a discussion we'll have. And on the county-owned land, I mean, that's a discussion we need to have too, because there's a lot of ways to use county-owned land, and this could be one, but there could be other types. I tend to believe that you want to maximize that to the hilt, and so a sixplex might not be enough, but in some places that might be all you could do, but maybe you could do more multifamily in some. So I just think we need to have that.
and the point
discussion
that
too.
you actually couldn't do most of this because it's not allowed by the zoning is quite relevant as well to this
Exactly.
county pilot idea.
So looking forward to it. So thank you.
So do we still have time for our other briefing? Are you all
Oh, is there
time
another briefing?
constrained? Yeah,
I probably not. What is the other briefing?
about our trends report.
Well, if there's no time for that, I wasn't going to say anything, but if you got just 30 seconds. Just to-
Hold on a quick second. All right, let's go to 12:15.
Okay, never mind.
Yeah, let's go
ahead.
to 12:15. Let's go to 12:15.
So we're going to whip through this fast. And if you want to control, I have the couple of the first slides, and I'm going to go through them super fast. You all know that we're updating the general plan. We just talked about it. This trends report is the first step in that process. With every good planning exercise, you do an existing condition study. And the last time our general plan was touched was in the early 1990s. So this analysis really takes us since about 1990 to the present in terms of looking at trends. You know that we're updating the general plan. It hasn't been updated for close to 50 years. And we have a lot of drivers and disruptive emerging trends that are changing the way we live, the way we work, the way we recreate, and it's time to take a look at the plan. Next. We've updated the plan, and we're updating the plan under the theme of Thrive. And we want to look at how, again, in many ways, we're an outstanding community. And we could just keep going, status quo, keep moving ahead as we are. But what we want to do is really say, how can we go above and beyond and not just maintain the status quo, but really thrive, and thrive so that 30 years from now, we are a model of equity, a model of economic health, a model of environmental resilience and sustainability. We're having,
And
could you go back
Thrive
real
Week
quick?
is this week, right?
Thrive Week is this week. We have been bombarding your aides to invite you
Yeah.
to the Thrive Week
I don't think this is
events.
going as we had hoped as far as council members participating. I
Some
don't know that I've
folks-
even committed to a specific event. I've got like
Well-
5 on my calendar.
Right. We would love
I'm there
for
on
you
Thursday.
to commit.
Okay.
Yes, you're committed on
Yappy hour.
Thursday.
Yes.
Yes.
going to Yappy Hour.
I'm working on downtown Silver Spring.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
I'll be representing the entire Fed committee, perhaps the whole council.
And we understand that the county executive is going to join us at the Saturday event in downtown Silver Spring. We're really excited about that.
And what is that? Is it like a dialogue on?
Well, all of these events are essentially part of larger, sort of very active events where a lot of people are coming anyway. And we are going to be there with our information, our recording artist who's going to get people's input and create on the, at the moment, images. We have a whole bunch of innovative ways for people to provide their input. And so it's not like a formal, stand up at the podium and give a talk kind of thing.
So
This
elected
is a-
officials invited will be there as resources, and people may just chit chat.
Absolutely, and we want for you all to have an opportunity to write your thoughts on the recording artist illustration. We want you to have an opportunity to talk to some of the staff and residents who are going to be there. So it's not a requirement to give a speech. It's
Okay.
really a requirement to just be there and to dialogue and listen. So please, please come.
I think if you required the speech, you might get more council members,
Yeah,
frankly.
true.
hate to be honest here about the motivations of myself and my colleagues, but something tells me that the microphone's kind of a draw when they get
Well,
to
we
use
will
it.
have microphones also, but I do want to emphasize this isn't a formal stand behind a podium and give a presentation kind of event.
Okay, well,
And please,
I-
please come.
I will attend what I can attend. I hope to be there for at least one or possibly several. I think we ought to figure out, subsequent to this launch, how can councilmember offices more directly partner with you to roll out the general plan?
We would love to do that, and again, we've been sort of blowing up your aides'
I
emails.
think it's a little overwhelming.
to-
So I think a more, constrained request. How can we do something together? Just, can we come over and meet and plan something? Like, come over for an hour with each office, nail down something.
Okay,
I
we
think
can
that would
certainly
be-
do that.
I think that'd be terrific.
Great. So let's get into the discussion of the trends.
For the record, I'm Carrie McCarthy, the Division Chief for Research and Special Projects at the Planning Department. Want to really acknowledge the outstanding research team who did the research and drafted this report. And since it was released in January, we've done about a dozen roadshow presentations, brought it out to the community to a couple of chamber meetings, the Civic Federation. We're happy to do more if you hear from constituents who are interested in getting a briefing on the report. To start off with an easy data point, Montgomery County has about 1 million people. We've been over 1 million since 2012. We're the second largest county in the Washington, D.C. region behind Fairfax. And it's pretty unique to be a county this large. Less than 2% of counties, of the 3,100 counties in the country, have more than 1 million people. We've grown 38% since 1990. And as Gwen mentioned, this report looked at existing conditions and changes since 1990. We've picked that period because that was when the last refinement to the general plan was done. And we really focus on what's changed. We've done a little bit of benchmarking with other counties, but this report's not intended to be a detailed benchmarking exercise. The graph on the right is interesting because that shows the gain and changes in the gain and rate of growth since 1990s. And going back even to the 1950s and 60s, you can see that the county was growing 107% that decade in the 50s, 53% in the 60s. And when you think about the original general plan and the environment they were developing that plan is, that was really rapid growth. Where today, what we're seeing forecasting forward, we're expecting about 7 to 10% growth per decade. We say about 200,000 people by 2045, and so that's still a big number, but on a percentage basis, it's really not as rapid as the growth that was happening in the county in the 60s. These maps show the location of growth by census tract. The map on the left is total. The map on the right is adjusted for density due to differences in the census tract size. And it's kind of what you'd expect since the 1990s. A lot of the growth has been in the outer lying areas, Clarksburg, Germantown. Adjusted on a per capita basis, it's really densified along the 270 corridor, along the kind of Georgia Avenue corridor, 29 corridor, and along the metro stations. Immigration is really important in this county and it has contributed to significant diversity. 56% of our county is people of color. And if we look at the graph on the right, it compares the racial and ethnic composition in the county in the 1990s with 2016. 1990, when they did the last general plan refinement, it was 72% non-Hispanic white. 7.4% Hispanic, 12% Asian, 12% Black or African American, 8% Asian, and then 0.4% other race. Today, it's really quite different. 44.5% non-Hispanic white, 19% Hispanic, 17.8% Black or African American, 14.8% Asian, and 3.9% other race. And so as we're thinking about outreach and the population, we're really thinking about it's a much different population than it was in the 1990s, and we're working hard to kind of get into areas that have been traditionally participated in public outreach to a smaller degree. Foreign-born immigration is also significant in the county. It was only 19% of the population in 1990. It's a third today. Majority.
A third of the county is foreign-born.
Exactly.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Wow. I remember when I first ran for office, someone said, you can't get elected here unless you're really from here. And today, nobody is from here.
Except the majority of the FED committee.
Yeah, all right. Yeah. We're gonna outrule that one. We're gonna 2-1 vote that one
I
down.
lost that vote.
And this we wanted to kind of simplify the mapping of the demographic changes and the diversity changes in the county. So in these two maps, the dark blue shows tracts that are predominantly white, and we defined predominant as only over 70% of the population. Light blue is white majority, 50 to 70%. Green is Black majority, 50 to 70%. And then yellow is no predominant racial or ethnic group. So there's no one racial or ethnic group with more than 50% of the population in the tract. The map on the left is what the landscape looked like in 1990. The map on the right looks like what the landscape looks like today. And so you really see the yellow corridor coming down 270 across through the eastern part of the county, red line, that it's not just we're highly diverse, it's really highly integrated, based on the census tract level analysis. Yeah.
It's we're commenting a lot back here with the mics off.
Where is that little pocket in Bethesda to the left that turned light blue? Where is that? Right to the left of the B. What is that area? I'd be curious. We can come back to that, but I'm just curious to know.
Yeah, what neighborhood that is.
What happened there? What the.
It's like River Road inside the Beltway.
We can go past it, but at some point I just would like to dig deeper into this map. This is very, very interesting.
And we've put some of these maps online so you can go in and zoom in a little bit closer. Than I know it's hard with the. I'm glad we got to go briefly today because I think some of the data in this report really corresponds to some of the conversation we had about missing middle housing. As you know, we're an aging population. By 2040, we expect 21% of the population to be 65 plus. But then we also have a large number of millennials. About 1 out of 5 residents are between 20 and 34 in 2016. We remain a highly educated county. This graph compares gains in educational attainment 1990 today. You can see in 1990, overwhelmingly, the largest single group was folks that had high school or some college at 41%. Today, that group is 33%, but we've had a kind of corresponding offset in the percentage of people with graduate or professional degrees, now at 32%. 59% of the population has at least a BA compared to 50% in the region. And we have the 5th highest concentration of advanced degrees in the US.
Okay, so so clearly many of those international immigrants are coming here with advanced degrees.
Exactly.
That's it. Wait, so again, you're going very quick. It's hard to absorb. I know you're under a time pressure here, but
I think it's important to note that in addition to an increase in Hispanic population, there's a very large increase in Asian population, and that we are diverse in terms of the ethnicity, and one sort of
So interesting.
model is that we are having still very highly educated,
well, actually, yeah. If you look at this, what
highly
you see,
educated populace.
the no high school diploma is basically the same. The some college has fallen while the advanced has risen. So we've swapped out those without a bachelor's degree as a share and replaced that percentage with advanced degrees. So we are much more highly educated than we used to be, I think, overall, despite, that's fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah,
I didn't say despite, I should say because of, but, you know, I think the perception might be what you, otherwise.
I think this is fascinating. I wish we could actually take a little bit more time on this. Can we get like a quick highlight now? But I'd love to come back to this at a
Yeah, we could come back. We have
subsequent
some time
meeting.
in July. We can continue this. We don't feel like we have to get everything in. We'll bring you back.
Yeah.
Because everything else we talk about is talking about this, right? I mean, we talk about economic development, workforce development, housing, you know, all of the zoning, all the things that we're talking about are related to what are the demographics, what are they, who is here, where are they, why are
back.
they here?
Go back
I mean, I
to
think
that
this
slide.
is kind of at the heart of everything.
This is, go back, please. That right there was the heart of our pitch to Amazon. It was that we are an international, highly educated, you know, public-minded, purpose-driven community. That is the workforce right there for the tech economy, right there. I mean, we've got a incredible workforce.
And I think
combination.
there's been, like, to your point, there's been an undercurrent of the demographic changes in the county, and this speaks, you know, quite a different story, candidly and frankly, about, you know, what those demographic changes mean. They certainly come with all kinds of different elements to them, but they don't come with less education. They don't, you know, the people come here because we have a great education from all over the world, and they're attracted to all kinds of federal labs and private sector interests related to those, you know, labs that make this, you know, place to be. But I think it's really important. Could I ask, when we come back to this, could we also add, it doesn't have to be part of a formal presentation, but just be prepared to talk about it if you could, how our growth relates to other growth, not just in the region, but in similar, you know, suburban, you know, large suburban jurisdictions surrounding major cities? Because, you know, I always, you know, joke around about the Yogi Berra line when people talk about how many people we have and how much growth there is. And, you know, Yogi Berra said, you know, nobody wants to go to that restaurant anymore. It's way too crowded. And, you know, you hear that a little bit here of, you know, if we keep growing at the rate that we're growing, nobody's going to want to be here. And I kind of think, well, I'm not sure how you can grow to the point where nobody wants to come. And so I just think it's important to understand, because, you know, you talked about it in the other slide of what our growth has been, the 36% or 38% since 1990, which has really tailed off actually recently, as was noted in that, you know, to less than a percentage point a year. But it's a lot of people because we're a large jurisdiction. But it would be helpful to see, you know, is our growth good? Is it bad? Is it healthy? Is it unhealthy? I think the context here, beyond just the numbers, would be great.
Go on.
This graph shows the distribution of household types actually going back since the 60s. And it's notable because, again, with changes in the county, a lot of thought about the structure of household types, that a lot of the most dramatic changes took place between the 60s and 1990. Between 1990 and today, the changes have been more at the margin. So in 1960, the county, 60% were married couples with children, 27% were married couples without children. Single parents didn't show up, 6% other family, 8% non-family. Going ahead to today, we have 25% married couples with children under 18, 30% married couples without children under 18, 8% single parent households, 7% other family, and that's multi-generational households, grandparents, and then 30% is non-family, which is both people living alone, unrelated people living together. Interestingly, in this change, the past 25 years, there's been a slight uptick in average household size in the county between 1990 and today. We went from 2.65 to 2.77 persons. And that follows, actually, there was a very significant decline in average household size between 1960 and 1990. I think it means it's still an attractive county for families, and we still have slightly larger households than national averages, just slightly.
What is the national average? 2 point something something.
Yeah, I don't know that
but we're slightly above, you said.
Looking at my demographer, we'll have
Come
that.
back
we'll
to
have
me,
that.
that's-
Good question. These maps show income. The map on the left in blue is the 2016 portrait of average household income, which was $135,000. And again, not surprisingly, it's really kind of west side of the county, outer east side of the county are the wealthiest areas, and a little bit around Four Corners. Map on the right shows the change in average household income between 1990 and 2016, where the dark brown areas represent the greatest change, an increase of over $50,000, and those are really heavily concentrated inside the Beltway.
Okay, so, right, the darker the color,
Yeah.
the more
More
the
change.
increase in the income.
Yeah, and then the lightest yellow is actually areas that have decreased.
Wow.
I mean, I think this is important, not just the income inequality and the inequities and all the other issues that we talk about that are as acute here as they are anywhere else, if not more, but between 1990 and 2016, the median income has increased $8,000.
That's average. That's just the average, and this is adjusted for inflation, so it's about 6%. The median household income's lower, it's about $100,000.
Okay, so median versus, yeah,
Average,
okay.
yeah.
So I was gonna say, because 135 is higher than the number that I normally use, but it's
Yeah.
average versus median.
Yeah.
Median's like 100, a little over 100,
yeah.
between 100 and 110.
Yeah,
Right,
yeah.
okay. So 8,000, could you just put, the 8,000 up 6.3%, that's adjusted for inflation? That's not,
No, that's
that's adjusted
inflation.
dollars?
Yep.
Okay.
We get
It would
more
be helpful,
interesting-
sorry, it would be helpful on that to compare, because that's not very good.
Yeah.
It would be helpful to compare that to the jurisdictions also in terms of the growth that we're seeing and then how the average income has changed in other similar jurisdictions, because 6% adjusted over 26 years
Well,
is
and-
staggeringly bad.
We can look at that, but when you start high, that you have to remember what the overall number is, which is much higher than many many jurisdictions.
Yeah, but it's
in this
apples to
country.
oranges because you're not, I mean, you're starting high, but it's relative to living costs.
Well, and I think
And so, I mean, look at, if we want to have that argument, I'm happy to have that conversation, but if you compare 1990 to 2016, adjusted dollars versus adjusted dollars of living costs for housing,
Next
groceries,
slide.
et cetera.
Yeah, that's this next slide.
and that's the next
This
slide.
is where it gets rough.
Yeah. So yeah, in that, just showing the question of income related to housing affordability, we put it together on one slide so it's easy to see the numbers. And this is since 2000. the index changes in housing costs and income. And so the orange dotted line is the change in average household income. You can see that's flat. The gray line that goes up and down, that's the average sales price of attached home and condos. And again, there was really a bubble in the early 2000s, and those haven't recovered as much from the Great Recession. But the green and the blue line are where things are really interesting. Particularly the green, you can see that's the change in average rent per square foot. And again, all these figures are adjusted for inflation. That's really had a steadily upward rise. The blue is the average sales price in single-family detached home. Big bubble in the early to mid 2000s, kind of crashed from the Great Recession, and slow recovery, but still very high overall. We looked at,
Can you go back? Do you have that average rent per square foot by different parts of the county as well?
we can give it to you. We broke it out in the report based on CBD versus non-CBD, Central Business District, and the rents increased. It's about, in the Central Business District, they increased from about $1.30 per square foot to $1.95 per square foot, which comes out of a change of about $1,300 to $1,950 for a 1,000 square foot apartment. But we can give you some additional details. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, and just on that, I really am interested. That's been a steady increase. It's been resilient. Is one way to
Yeah.
to frame it, but not for the people paying it. But
Yeah.
even when housing prices have dipped,
Yeah.
it's continues to rise.
Yeah.
Well, you see it right out. It picked up after the recession. In the recovery, it shifted away from being it wasn't already, I guess, a renter's market, but it got much worse.
Yeah.
Oh, but if there were any indication that housing is a supply and demand game, it's this.
Yeah.
There was markedly less money in the economy, and yet there was almost no impact on rental rates. The housing purchase prices plummeted, the housing value prices plummeted, and rentals kept going up and up and up and up and up and up and up, because this is a function of supply and demand. And so any conversation that we have that doesn't focus on housing as a function of supply and demand is proven completely inaccurate by this chart and any other.
Supply, because supply slowed down right about the same time.
Well, that's because the next slide. We've had a 32% increase in the number of housing units since 1990. This growth has been predominantly in multifamily units. Those increased by 40%, 49%, compared to only 25% increase in the number of single-family units. We did some analysis of teardowns.
You ran through that one. Go
Sure,
back.
Back. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, all right. I think we're going to continue this next time.
All right.
Can I just ask one more follow-up question for this? The 32% increase in the number of housing units, it's really useful, but it'd be helpful if we could compare the types. We have single family, but like 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, 3 bedroom, because if it's not reflective of the total, this is less than the total growth of the population. If you're creating a house for 5 new people, then you could fit 5 people. If you're creating a 3-bedroom apartment for 4 people, that makes sense. But if you're creating a 1-bedroom for 4 people, all those housing units are not created equal. So there's some way to look at that, since most of the increase is coming from multifamily. The size of the multifamily then really matters. And so I think it would be, if there's any data on that, I think that'd be helpful for the follow-up conversation too. 2
more housing slides if you got two minutes, we can just wrap it up real quick. This we looked at teardowns, and this really relates to the point about in the missing middle study that there's been a lot of teardown activity, mainly in Bethesda, about 50% of all teardown units. And if developers can just make more money tearing down a $900,000 house and building a $2 million house, that's what they're going to do all day. We really haven't seen a lot of redevelopment of multifamily buildings. Only 6 buildings have been redeveloped since 1990, which has resulted in a net increase in total units.
Yeah, I want to emphasize that. We hear about the loss of, market rate affordable housing. It has been a total of 6 projects.
I hear about that from the county executive. The county executive always
And
likes
others,
to posture
but-
his opposition to housing as, I oppose tearing down affordable housing and replacing it with housing for millennials, was his quote, actually. If anyone says that, I'm going to fight that. 65%, blah, blah.
And of the
happening.
6 that have come down, at least 3 were projects done by affordable housing providers that created more affordable housing. An example is the building next to the Silver Spring Library.
This wielding of this issue as though there's like a gentrification issue going on in our rental housing stock, and that's grounds to oppose redevelopment and new housing is just phony.
And then this last slide is really what given our theme of next slide. Yep. Given our housing conversation this morning, wanted to get in front of you. So since 1990, we've had a slight decline in the overall home ownership rate from 67.9% to 64.7%. And that really echoes national trends. The thing that really of the report, one of those data points surprised me the most is just the really dramatic decline in home ownership for households under 35. That rate declined from 46.1% in 1990 to 28.4% today. And the decline in Montgomery County actually exceeds the decline in the nation. Nationally, home ownership rates for this demographic declined from 38.5% to 34.5%.
Thrown into that rental market where prices
Yeah.
continue to rise.
Yeah, and there's a lot of factors. We're highly educated, so maybe a lot of student debt are keeping out of the market. Affordable housing, availability of a product people want to live in. But I just thought that was sort of really shocking. And just
Millennials, the ones that
Yeah.
the famous quote referred to as not really deserving of consideration about their housing needs, quite frankly.
Yeah.
Okay,
So
so we got that out there.
yeah.
We have more slides about the job growth, but we'll save those for the next time we're together.
Yeah.
Thank you.